Remember when there were 6 billion people on this planet? How about 7 billion just a decade ago? Well, we just crossed over the 8 billion, and if we don't slow down at some point, we may face some resource issues. It's a pretty hotly debated issue as to what Earth's actual carrying capacity is, and what would that look like when we reach or even potentially exceed that capacity? Would we develop new technology? Would we slow down having children and maybe let one generation go out at a much more controlled rate? Or would we nuke ourselves into oblivion because that sounds mega dystopian? Well, given what we know about Calhoun's rodent utopia experiment, my money would be on society just dissolving at large and us falling back into a Mad Max style of existence for a while until someone comes up with this great idea to civilize us again, creating a never-ending cycle until we get hit by an asteroid. But what if there was another way? What if instead of having one box that we're all running around in, we have 2 boxes? Would that help humanity restart or at least kick the can down the road? Possibly. In the events of Pandorum, humanity is under the pressure of a resource crisis. In the immortalized words of Danik from Dead Space 3, there's too many with too little to go around. Of course, turning people into necromorphs isn't the move either. With war after war for resources becoming more common by the year, and the environment virtually destroyed due to the acquisition of these resources, humanity is forced to send a probe into space to a planet named Tanis, which is suspected of being habitable. After finding out life does in fact reside on the planet's surface, an ark of sorts was sent out to allow for humanity to flourish on this world, while hopefully Earth gets its population issues under control. And if it doesn't, well, at least humanity goes on. However, it's not about the destination, it's like about the journey, man, as some hippies would say. While en route, clearly something goes wrong, leading to a struggle for survival against literal monsters. But what exactly are these monsters? And how do they come to be? Well, let's discuss that in today's episode. But first, this episode is sponsored by Factor. It's a new year, and every year I bet you're a lot like me. You say, yo, this is the year I get into shape and start eating healthier. And then by February, you're like knocking back burgers like you wouldn't believe and saying, 2024 is gonna be my year. Don't you wish there was a way out of like the meal prep trap so that you had something just ready to go and ready to eat? Well, there is. Factor makes meeting your nutrition goals easier by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian approved meals right to your doorstep. These meals help you save time, give you a cleaner overall diet, which can have benefits like better health and improved energy levels, and they taste really good. I've been getting Factor delivered for like the last few months, actually, like not even for this ad, just because I thought the meals were tasty. So they were delivered to my home as I have been working out more and focusing on my health now that I've crossed over into the dreaded 30s. And it has been absolutely awesome watching muscle be packed on due to the protein-dense meals that I'm getting, and I just feel better in general. So if that sounds like something that you're looking for, then by heading to go.factor75.com/Roanoke60 and using code Roanoke60, you can get 60% off your first Factor box. So with 2023 here, it's gonna be cold and you're gonna be inside anyways, so you might as well sequester yourself with healthy meals as well. All right, let's get back to it. Before we start, I have appreciated everyone who's been subscribing lately, and to those who have stuck around, glad to see that you guys are enjoying the content, and I've actually been having a blast returning back to the biology of video games, so more on the way with that, but let's get to it. We kick off our story with a history lesson. In 1969, man lands on the moon, and there were about 3.6 billion of us. In 2009, the Kepler telescope was launched to find Earth-like planets, and there are 6.76 billion of us. In 2153, I have been dead for a long time, and the Paleo 17 space probe lands on planet Tanis. The world population is at 24.34 billion, with food and water shortages pretty commonplace. In 2174, I am still dead, unfortunately, but the battle for Earth's limited resources reaches a boiling point, and Elysium is launched into space. As Elysium drifts through space, it's a massive ship, but many languages are being sent to that ship. Essentially, it says, you're all that's left of us, good luck and Godspeed. Basically, Earth ain't doing so hot. We now jump over to a woman mouthing I love you as man wakes up feeling exactly how I felt on January 1st, confused and screaming. His pod opens up, releasing him, and he has no idea where he is. His skin is looking like beef jerky, so apparently he has been in stasis for quite some time. That's gotta be really like satisfying actually peeling that off. Sort of like sunburn peeling. But he goes and then checks on the other pods. Some are gone and some are still in there. His pod closes, revealing that his name is Bauer. Checking the equipment, he heads to his locker and seems to remember at least a few things, so that's good. Obviously, he hasn't remembered everything, and then he finds a picture of his wife and then reads about hypersleep resulting in memory loss. He then heads over to Lieutenant Peyton's pod to get him up and just starts beating on it like a caveman. So he gives up on that and then goes to shave, which I don't know, bruh, keep the beard. As he shaves, the ship violently shakes as Lieutenant then exits his pod. Lieutenant asks where they are, but Bauer has no idea either. Bauer goes on to say that he remembers the training, but not the destination. So basically, they are both suffering from memory loss at this point. Very good. They find evidence evidence of someone trying to get out of the room and then start up the emergency generator. As they sit there, the ship continues to shake violently as they hear something in the ventilation shaft. So this is like Dead Space the movie, by the way. So Bauer is sent into that ventilation shaft, no thanks, to get to the next room. While going through, however, he starts having a panic attack and he gets disoriented. The lieutenant is able to calm him down, but then the lieutenant starts hearing something in the walls. Bauer realizes he's now at an angle and drops down into another shaft, which I have no idea how he didn't just like snap his neck completely. Then he cracks open a glow stick and finds that another crew member is next to him, completely desiccated. This means that that dude had been down there for quite some time. Bauer is able to get the vent open and then falls into a locker room. Exiting out of it, he enters a long hallway, which is extra spooky. As he tries to get in contact with Peyton, he hears some noises. Seeing someone down the hallway, he approaches, but she nopes out of there before he spots another person. He approaches them, asking questions, but they do not respond. And oh my god, it's a giant blur screen! Man, that was really scary. Don't blame me, blame the policy changes. But the woman grabs him and then goes to steal his shoes hilariously, and he says he's a part of the flight crew, but then is interrupted by some growling in the dark. The blur screen then nopes up into the roof as Bauer takes off running for the locker room. Something runs by too quick for him to see as he looks down and spots it. It's a humanoid of some sort as it yells to the rest of the pack. Hiding in a locker, he gets a look at it, but Peyton comes in over the radio at the wrong time, almost giving up his position. Well, technically I guess he did, as the thing then drags off Cooper's desiccated body. Bauer reports back to Peyton about the things, but he doesn't believe him, of course. Peyton mentions how they're on their own, 60,000 people on a single launch trajectory. There is no help coming. Then we get a flashback. Apparently now there were 45 billion people on the probe landed on Tanis, which appears to be a mistake, as the movie mentioned there were only 24 billion in the beginning. But as the probe landed, photosynthesis was spotted. Never mind the likely microbial life that could send you into anaphylactic shock in 3 seconds once entering your lungs. Also, Bauer thinks his wife is somewhere on board, and he needs to find her before the monsters do. Peyton tries to talk him off the ledge and say that they need to control the systems first, save the ship, and then save them. Bauer now finds the non-unaliving riot force multipliers, good lord, which will come in handy. So Peyton updates Bauer's rig so that he can be the engineer he is and go to the reactor. See, this is literally Dead Space with Isaac. But Bauer then heads down the corridor, his hands start shaking, to which he asks Peyton about Pandorum. This reminds Peyton of Eden, which was the biggest catastrophe in space travel. Basically, a guy lost his mind and they called it Pandorum, and he fired all the ship's life pods, which the colonists were, in those, and off into space. 5,000 people confined to their pods, floating in space to suffocate. Massive bummer. Entering another corridor, Bowers is clearly being followed. Bowers also sees someone at the end of this hallway and thinks that he might be hallucinating. However, this guy wakes up, which Bowers then releases him. It's a guy from Team 6 called Shepard, so maybe it's Mass Effect. But this guy is confused how Team 5 is even awake. He tells him to run from the monsters, which is good advice, and then starts covering himself in fluids to hide his smell. Problem is that the monsters are already here. Bowers and Shepard take off as Bowers screws up a jump QuickTime event and then falls into a pit as Shepard is pulled up and then eaten. So I guess he passed the QTE. Yeah, good for him. But Bowers gets noticed at this point as he nopes out and almost falls to his end, but gets caught in a trap. However, the creatures are pretty much on it and try to pull him up, but he's rescued by a dude who doesn't speak the same language, so there's a bit of an issue there. Bowers reads the guy's tattoo and finds out that he's agriculture and tells him reactor. So this guy has been living on his own there, clearly is strapped, but Bowers tells him to stay there, like, nah brah, it's a numbers game. Meanwhile, back at the pods, Peyton begins hearing screeching and closes the vents, but gets a random nosebleed. Bowers enters a container, opens a door, and gets attacked by the woman from earlier as Mr. Agriculture shows up to attack her. Bauer fires a shot up into the air, and that name is becoming very difficult to say, to break them up, and gives a speech that Agriculture is not going to understand, but they decide to work together as a team and, be human. The woman begins asking if Bauer is really part of the flight crew, and he tells her the plan, but she says nobody ever comes back from the reactor. She pulls a knife on him, and he says he can fly the ship. So she agrees to show them the way. That was pretty easy. As she goes to open the door, the creatures begin their attack as they head inside a Resident Evil hallway as they close the door on the creatures before they can get in. This woman is apparently a part of the ecological development team. Nerd, figures. They have lost 30% of the specimens, so things aren't looking too good. The ship has a generator, but they need to get the reactor started. Hopefully in the future, we learn to put several reactors on a ship to power it. Redundant systems. But we get some info from Mrs. Scientist. She eats bugs, that's all we need to know. She suggests that they've actually been asleep longer than they think. Meanwhile, Peyton is having a great time as some dude exits the ship's bowels birth style, covered in grease. He says he's a part of the flight crew and his name is Gallo, Corporal Gallo. So he lays on the ground and cries for a while, not answering anything useful. Back at the actual group that gets things done, they find the colonist area. The development settlers are being eaten pretty regularly by these monsters as they are released regularly, but it is the only way to the reactor. Bauer and, did we ever actually learn her name? No, I don't think so. I'm just gonna call her Scientist. Scientist fall into some water with a bunch of leftover human pieces as the monsters move above, continuing their hunt. Think of the pathogens down there. But they crawl back out of the water, smelling worse for wear, as a scout has spotted Bauer. Bauer gets shoved into a pod as he's able to regain composure and attacks the creature, but that thing is jumping all over them like a single mom after 2 bottles of wine. They're able to subdue it and just sort of like gang stomp it out, which was kind of hilarious, as then another spawns them and causes the horde to descend. Also, one guy gets let out of his pod and immediately attacked. Like, that sucks. What a way to wake up. Peyton continues to try and contact Bauer to no avail. He goes to check on Gallo and then wakes him up. Gallo doesn't know anything as he's not a navigator, so he has no idea where they are. He was in Flight Team 4 and says it was Pandorum. He had to defend himself. Back at Alpha Team, they move through some more vents that look strangely familiar with the creatures on their tails as they shut and lock it. However, once entering the pits, they find a guy above them. He begins talking to them and lets them stay there. He mentions how he can cook them some food and they haven't eaten, so yeah, that's probably preferable. Bauer talks to the scientist, wondering if that's some sort of life form on board. She says it's an enzyme that was given to jumpstart human evolution once they landed on Tanis, although it really wouldn't be evolution. I think it'd be more changing like selective advantageous traits, but we'll kind of get into that later. But anyhow, those are colonists that adapted to the ship rather than to the planet. Sort of right, but again, we'll get there. The cook now chimes in, saying he knows what happened. Basically, as the ship was flying through space, the flight crew were told that Earth was gone. When they did scans, the whole planet was absent. This alarmed several of the crew, as everything they knew and loved was just obliterated. And not by some asteroid, but by man. This caused a lot of them to experience Pandorum, and Pandorum's actual scientific name is Orbital Dysfunctional Syndrome, or ODS. Basically, it's brought on by a psychological trigger, which would be, the planet blowing up. That's probably a big one for a lot of people, and this caused them to become paranoid and aggressive, which actually, moving away from the movie for a second, this could potentially be real. The Earth is said to have a certain hum to it, like a frequency of vibration that, considering how long we've been here, our bodies are used to feeling. Now, I'm not talking about walking outside doing like perennial sunning or anything like that, but it's something our bodies feel, and in the absence of it, there's actually marked symptoms. Astronauts have been said that they notice this absence in orbit, which gives them anxiety and influences behavior to a degree as a result. So if you are in deep space for long enough, the anxiety could actually turn into paranoia and aggression due to the cascading effects of stress responses that the body has. That'll be another thing that we need to overcome if we ever want to get off this rock and in a more permanent way. As the group then listens to the cook talk about what happened, they start feeling a little odd from the food that they have been eating. Peyton and Gallo begin arguing over it, as one of the flight crew in particular decided to apparently stay up and play while the others were asleep, and also while he took out the ones that are with him. So now everyone is upside down. The cook has tied everyone up to eat them. He seems to be losing it. Bowers appeals to his survival guilt as he has enough humanity left, but as Bowers says he can save the ship, the cook then goes to attack him. Bowers says that the ship though is about to blow up and they need to save the reactor, so it's up to him to make the call. The cook actually listens to him and then cuts him down after he tells him they have about less than an hour to get there. Peyton also seems passing out at this point, so that's not good. Peyton then calls back and confirms that they have about 47 minutes until the system completely fails. Moving through another corridor, they then spot Caillou in the air vents. It runs off before Agricultural Man can actually get to it, as the adults now show up. They run and close the door, but that has sort of trapped them. Meanwhile, Gallo is talking in Peyton's ear about getting out of there. Bowers then enters the room where all the flight crew's families are gone, but Bauer remembers his wife actually isn't there. Major oops, he left her on Earth like a total nerd. Although, why would she stay there? Earth seemed it seemed like a total crapshoot by that point anyways. She stayed behind and got blown up when the Earth did. So this just solidifies the idea to go on Elysium because she left him. Scientist woman then tells him they were meant to go on. So rather than him breaking down at that point, he just kind of chilled out. I mean, hey, prospects on the horizon, am I right? Gallo then begins telling Peyton that they need to get off the ship with a giant nosebleed. Peyton refuses this suggestion, obviously. Meanwhile, Team Ramrod is approaching the reactor. Looking down on it, this looks really unsafe. There's not even a handlebar or anything right there. Peyton yells to the corporal to stand down as a fight is ready to ensue, and in the reactor, all the monsters are sleeping. Bauer then walks across one of the walkways and falls, but is able to hold on to a lower beam. Scientist lady then goes and opens the reactor door to restart it. The corporal is standing looking in a mirror and begins breaking stuff to look tough, yelling about how this flight is over. Meanwhile, Bauer is crawling through the slumber party and begins wrapping himself up to cover his scent. The corporal then gets stuck in a pod to be launched, but it was just a simulation all along. Then something odd happens. As the corporal is stuck in there, he yells at Peyton it's an order to open that door and says he will gut him like a pig, and that'll be important later. Gallo says the corporal is killing all of them with that move, which again isn't Peyton the lieutenant. Peculiar to say the least. So Bauer keeps crawling through what I can only imagine smells horrible as a flashlight gets dropped and everyone is woken up. The cook nopes out of there because he's a loser, and agricultural man drops the walkway. He takes off running as well as they're on his tail as scientist and Bauer then restart the reactor. They are successful, which then blasts apart everyone below. Nice. And with full power on, Gallo says to let him out, but Peyton isn't doing it. Gallo says they'll now know what you did, as we then move back to agricultural man. The leader approaches him but sees that he is spearless, so he tosses him his spear to make it even, as apparently these things have honor. And then a predator style fight begins. Peyton now mutes Gallo, but then he can still talk in his head. Yes, Peyton has Pandorum, it seems. The cook leaves behind everyone as agricultural takes out the leader. The issue is Caillou is standing in the corner. He then goes to take him out, but unfortunately hesitates, which you should never do with that giant turd, and he ends up getting sliced for it. Peyton is now wrestling with his demons as he begins saying what Gallo is. They then merge into one as Peyton hits the cook in the eye with a sedative. Dude sort of deserved it, to be honest with you. Meanwhile, the monsters are blocked outside as they head to the flight deck. They find the flight crew desiccated, meaning they've been there for a very long time, and Bauer approaches Peyton, who isn't really Peyton. He is Corporal Gallo. The lieutenant is sitting over there as a skeleton. Gallo was younger than Bauer when he first got onto the ship, but after they received that call from Earth, he lost it. Bauer asks where they are as they open the shields above and there are no stars. Bauer at this point is also resisting falling into Pandorum as Gallo goes on about why morality is lame. So they get into a fight over it, but as they do, the scientist spots something. There's actually life around the ship. They already crashed on Tanis. It's been 923 years since the mission began. So literally, when Corporal Gallo was screaming to Peyton about how this flight is already over, apparently that was like his regular brain and not the insanity taking hold. But it's kind of strange that then when he merged with them, the insanity was completely taking. I don't really get that part. Anyways, Gallo continues his attack as the monsters begin attempting to get in. Scientist gets in a knife fight with Gallo. I wish I was that cool, as Bauer begins succumbing to his insanity, thinking things are coming in. He instead shoots a panel, which then breaks the glass overhead, which lets in the water. This makes him come to as he grabs the scientist and gets in a pod with her. Double nice. The monsters start drowning as their pod is released into the water as it heads up towards the surface, with Bauer starting to drown. Bro, share the air. They breach the surface of the water, with some of the ship actually being exposed still. Because of the hull breach, an emergency ejection system is enacted as the rest of the colonists are woken up and put onto the surface of the water. So then it pans outwards. 1,213 of the original 60,000 colonists survived the trip, which is a genetic bottleneck like you wouldn't believe. Humanity at one point appears to have decreased to around 2,000 in our past, which left us in a very similar scenario as this one if you didn't know, or at least that's hypothesized. So careful planning for breeding and genetic recombination is critical, unless you want a bunch of Habsburg jaws running around. So to understand the colonists becoming what they did on the ship, we must first learn about the actual process of evolution, or in this case, adaptation. There is a large difference between adapting to an environment on a single generational level and evolving to adapt to an environment, which will be the highlight of how absolutely wild this plan was. First things first, yes, to a degree, you can adapt to your environment. If you couldn't do that, well, there would likely be none of us in any new environments anywhere. In fact, it is said that if we were to visit other planets over time, we would evolve there, but there would be a few factors that we need to get used to within a single person's lifetime, and this would be an adaptation to that environment first generation. When you adapt or have a selective advantage to something on a person-by-person basis, this might be something sort of like dealing with the cold or heat better. If you remain in a warm environment over your lifetime, after moving from a colder environment that you were adapted to, you may sweat more as your body is more prone to doing that because of the more heat that you're having to contend with. If you move to an area with stronger sunlight or more direct sunlight, your skin will become more tan to ward off genetic damage caused by UV radiation if you, say, move from the north or south. Likewise, if you move to a colder climate, then odds are over time you will adapt to the cold, making you feel less cold the longer you stay. And this is why Georgia is absolutely horrendous at this point, because it was 8 degrees like last week, and today the high is 73 with tornadoes. Amazing. But adaptation on this small scale overall hardly makes you more suited to the environment in a successful and thriving way. Basically, you're just able to deal with it. Instead, it just aids you in feeling more comfortable typically. One of the best examples I can use here, and bear with me on the pronunciation because this is the first time I've ever actually uttered these words in my life, the Bujau Laut, people who are more adapted to diving and existing in the ocean than the average person, like I said, are great examples. What we see is evolution at work, but selective advantage traits being passed along. For instance, these people have 50% larger than normal spleens, which allows for them to have more red blood cells than normal, which allows for more saturation of the body with oxygen. This allows for them on average to hold their breath for up to 5 minutes, and in some cases, up to 13 minutes and dive as deep as 200 feet. Whereas for most, this is a massive undertaking. Along with this, they can actually change their vision by using their eye muscles to a degree under the water, which changes the shape of the eye, and this removes the blurriness most people experience when seeing underwater with their unaided eye. It has been said at this point that they have a genetic adaptation towards diving, which is a direct line of evolution. But these traits didn't just originate out of nowhere. Instead, it's sort of like a snowball effect. A person does something for long enough and then teaches their kids how to do it. Over time, this actually does somewhat get encoded into the genes of a person, resulting in a more established phenotype that allows for them to exist in an environment better than their predecessors did. It's not always based on random gene mutations, but what selective advantages that species had at that time that allowed for them to pass along those genes. This idea really emerges with humanity because in the wild, yes, typically random changes that make you more viable are what allow you to reproduce. But at the height of our species and the fact that we have no natural predators where we are right now, you can physically not be adapted to your environment but still pass along your genes because that's how much we've just conquered this planet. Evolution is where the real process takes over on adapting a species to the environment. Now, I should note to hammer the point home before we get too far along, as I can already see the comments, evolutionary adaptations are called just that, adaptations. The reason I'm referring to the person themselves adapting versus a species adapting is because the colonists, had they not been altered by the enzyme, would have adapted to an environment at a normal level. And this is to show the differences they would be subjected to brought on by that enzyme that they were able to accomplish. The takeaway from all this is that you can adapt to an environment in small amounts, as you do have some play in your ability to do so, and I will explain why this is the case here momentarily, which is actually not a well-known or well-understood mechanism. Now, to make you evolve to a planet, you will basically be genetically adapted, which is generational. Those with selective advantages may get passed along in more wild environments, but again, in humanity, it's likely that everyone would be reproducing to colonize Tanis. Because of this, an idea was created. Have the individual adapt to the environment rather than waiting thousands or perhaps millions of years through somewhat successful generations until finally humanity would be able to fully exist on Tanis. To do so would require genetic tampering of our species, but in a way that would ultimately spell the downfall of the proposed 98% of the colonists. Like, that sucks. And to understand this, we have to understand what actually happened on board, because there are quite a few things left out. As you know, Gallo was not a great dude. After hearing that Earth had basically self-destructed, he took out his crewmates and became the person running the show, which that seemingly happened just after they received the message because he was standing at the beginning on the flight deck. But this was only possible because the trip that originally was supposed to only take 123 years ended up taking an extra 800 years. I mean, for reference, that's like a road trip that you're taking is supposed to end in 1222, but you're still on the same trip in 2022. I know, quick maths, right? But it puts it into perspective just how long of an overshoot this was. The passengers themselves were supposed to go into hypersleep during this time frame and never wake up until they had gotten to Tanis. The crew themselves were supposed to wake up every 2 years to make their rotations and keep the ship going. And this says to me there are two classes of people aboard, those who were exposed to the enzyme and those who were not. It's clear that the enzyme would need to do something to the genetic coding in order to make it somewhat mutagenic concerning certain aspects of the human genome, and because of this, the colonists needed to be kept in stasis so that they wouldn't be activated essentially on the ship. The flight crew, scientists, engineers, and doctors never got this enzyme and likely would have gotten it once reaching Tanis because the 2 years that they were aboard the ship, they would have adapted to this environment. But again, once the call from Earth came in, Gallo went full goblin mode. Taking out his co-pilots, he then obviously tampered with some systems aboard the ship, which led to the release of some colonists. It is mentioned, but never explicitly stated, that he would let out passengers, play with them for a while, whatever that means, but I think we all know what that means, And then they would either band together to try to overthrow him, or he would just get tired of them. He would then lock them in the cargo holds to their fates. He did this for what can be presumed to be roughly about 900 years, which is why he kept aging over time, as he has done this so many times before. It becomes clear at some point he became aware after waking up of what he had created, but continued anyhow. Because of this, those that were locked in the cargo hold long ago had to resort to cannibalism in order to survive, and the colonists released in this area became their hunting grounds, or at least were released in their hunting grounds so that they could be chowed out on. So these things are essentially the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of probably the first groups or two, but there are factors that led to their changes, which we'll get to in a moment. After enough time had passed, clearly a new species of humanity was created. While still appearing like humanoids, all that makes us is gone somewhat at this stage. Basically, really, humanity is clearly still in there despite their physical stature changing. It kind of seems like they've really more reverted back to a tribal society due to their isolation and scarcity of food, which means while physically they are adapted to their environment, mentally they may have remained very similar to a regular person. And this is to be absolutely expected. Imagine making an enzyme that can change a person to thrive on another planet and then accidentally messing up and causing them to basically regress in their mind because you changed the coding in their brain just because there was a low food scenario. On a brand new planet, anytime humanity has ever tried to colonize anything, not a brand new planet, but new land masses or, new areas or really anything, we have struggled and the bodies just start getting stacked. So clearly there should be fail-safes in order. So the human brain was likely untouched. If you took any group of people and put them in the same scenario where there were only stories told about what you used to be because it was hundreds of years ago, and generation after generation your people were forced to look people in the pods as food rather than as kin, you would probably start behaving this way as well. Because of this, the monsters in Pandorum, while having changed from human to this, they're still very much so human in the mind when it comes to a sense of honor and group tactics. They're obviously social pack hunters like humanity are, and they still behave similarly in non-hunting groups, choosing to be close to one another rather than apart, and they also appear to still have some form of hierarchy. All this is to say to me, apart from their massive mental trauma inflicted on these people for the last several hundred years, their changes appear to be almost just skin deep. Now, so to speak anyway. Clearly there are some physical changes to their body, which we need to talk about before getting to how an enzyme actually accomplished what it did. I know this is like all over the place this morning. It's like 6 a.m. and I've had 3 cups of coffee. So, starting with we can't see any feet, but considering most of the other structures of the body are very similar, we can assume the feet are like regular human feet. I could also see no structural changes in the legs throughout the movie, so this indicates that the plantigrade structuring of the legs still remains a dominant trait for these altered. Over time, their abdomens appear rather sucked in, likely due to the lack of food, as abdominal muscles can be regularly seen in the altered. However, this has the added effect of making them rather lithe as a result because of the lack of nutrition coming in. This has not affected their strength, however, as they appear to be able to overpower a full-grown man and throw them around like ragdolls, as it takes 3 regular humans to overpower 1 altered human. This feral strength is likely brought on by the enzyme affecting muscular contractions. There's not much to note about the arms or legs in general, but getting to the face is where we begin to see some interesting changes of societal note. It appears cut on the heads denote some sort of leadership role, as hunting parties show they have slices running from their foreheads to their noses, but the leader has the largest cut, with his nose being completely removed. The teeth are broken and sharp, with the skin appearing stretched over the skull. Skull structures have slight changes, with the cheekbones becoming more pronounced and the brow ridge actually being larger, which could possibly indicate more testosterone production in the body. The ears appear pinned to the sides of the head or completely missing. There is hair on the head, but only with the leader, suggesting that they can grow hair, but choose to cut it off. Or some have adapted to no hair at all, given the stable, constant temperature of the ship. But what's most interesting is, this is just one iteration of this new species. If we take an adult and compare it to the youngling version we see, known as Caillou, we see potentially that these creatures should look a lot different if they don't have the cuts and marring all over their body, or at least at the pre-puberty stage. The skin is smooth and gray. Interestingly, it sort of looks like what our species has been writing about for a very long time, with those known as the Greys. Shorter in some renditions and taller than others, gray-skinned aliens with large black eyes is basically what everybody says that they see when they're abducted. The same can be said for this creature, as the eyes are all black due to the low light levels of the ship and the lack of sunlight basically causing a lack of need for pigmentation. What this shows is that even from generation to generation, there is still still a high degree of variability amongst the species. So the question is why? Well, I believe it's very clear and of course goes to the enzyme, but not in a way that you think it would. Now, likely this enzyme was initially given to the colonists, and those that were woken up have long since expired. That means that potentially this enzyme would have affected the sex cells so that the traits that were either gained or lost by the founding colonists would be passed along or stricken from the species. This would be massively important because it highlights two things. First, this enzyme was never supposed to stay within the species for an extended period of time, apparently just 2 generations. It was the first push to get humans adapted, then it was supposed to be bred out. Second, it shows what happens should it stay in long term, which ain't great. Those that were released first and stuck in the cargo hold would have looked like regular humans at first, but probably more ravenous because they're starving. Over time, as they adapted to the ship, it would have probably been relatively minor, and they could have likely been re-socialized back into humanity had the ship landed on time. Well, had everyone been released on time, given what we know about it crashing into the ocean, it's been down there for like 800 years. But once they started having children and regularly eating colonists who contain this enzyme, the issue would have started to build up within their bodies. It's clear that this enzyme was able to be passed on by eating colonists. Once the original group that was released fed people to their children, this enzyme would enter their bodies and begin causing them to adapt to the ship further, and with the already changed information in their genetics, this presented another interesting issue: the ever-changing somatic genetic information. It's clear that every generation is more altered than the last. Here's kind of a layman's way of how it works. If you take a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy and extrapolate that out to several more generations of photocopying, errors in that copy will grow until you have basically the Mr. Incredible meme of aberrations. The same can be said for this genetic coding. The first group was very human. The second generation likely had changes and were more feral. The third group had skin changes and were likely paler, and the fourth generation is likely where the genetic alterations began to build up significantly until we finally get to the most recent generation, which, as mentioned, look like the Greys. All because this enzyme was being consumed every generation, leading to more and more changes to their physical form, which may not have been what they needed. Surprise, surprise. But the question is, how does the enzyme do what it does? I know, you've been waiting for this for like probably 30 minutes at this point. Well, I believe it's all based on recombination. So to start, what is recombination? Genetic recombination is typically what we see with the gametes with crossover events. It is essentially genes crossing over from other areas or other areas of the chromosome, at least with this specific example, that can lead to cell exhibiting different genes from somatic cells. This provides genetic variability and overall makes the species more healthy, as one disease cannot just come through and wipe us all out. It's highly important to also the random changes in genetic coding that can lead to a species adapting properly to an environment and surviving it long term, as these random changes will build up in the species if successfully passed on, and those that are disadvantaged will typically be weeded out over time as they are outcompeted for resources. That said, those are sex cells. The somatic cells, or the rest of your body, also undergoes a form of recombination, but we are actually getting to the limits of biological knowledge on this one because it's not known why this is even the case in a lot of ways. Basically, you have genetic recombination, which is the sex cells, again, that happens in meiosis, and then you have somatic cell recombination, which takes place in the somatic cell itself and then is inherited by the daughter cells. This is typically large-scale alterations of DNA, such as translocations and deletions. This, however, is not prevalent concerning something like point mutations. In the somatic cell DNA, there are known points or areas that experience somatic recombination, and these are called initiation sites. These initiation sites are influenced by genetic factors, so there are actually different amounts from person to person. These recombination sites can have an impact on the person in small and large ways. In the ways that this goes wrong, tumor suppression genes will recombinate, leading to a person to get cancer. And this is one of the interesting things that almost appears like part of the gene sequence is here to protect a cell from a dangerous environment. Possibly it could be seen as a cell's checkout clause should the multicellular organism no longer be conducive for its survival. This cell will then recombinate this area and begin living for itself, and I have to put a disclaimer, that's just a line of thinking, and that hasn't been confirmed anywhere. But this recombination site seems to exist in different amounts, again, in different people, and this would mean if you want to adapt to a specific planet, you need to change the person themselves, and with that, you would need to influence these initiation sites. I would have to imagine that at this current point in time, our understanding of these initiation sites are well beyond where they are now. Most of our information on this comes from unicellular organisms and their somatic recombination, with some experiments done on fruit flies that can be extrapolated out to mammals, since fruit flies are multicellular. With With another 150 years under our belt, odds are genetically we have a firm grasp on how not to do this randomly, but to influence certain sites for recombination on a routine schedule until a certain level of fitness in the environment is reached. This could look like several things: more red blood cell production with a large spleen for more oxygen saturation, different immunoglobulins to decrease allergic reactions with native flora of the planet, if the gravity is more or less, osteocytes compensating through genetic recombination to allow for a person to exist healthily without the loss or gain of too much bone mass. The list goes on and on. Typically, these things would be done through recombination concerning meiosis, but it's going to be a difficult task to raise kids who are adapted to the planet when you yourself are not. So the individual would need to be changed as well. All in all, this enzyme affects the genome initiation sites to spark this recombination event, leading to somatic cells that are more suited to the environment. The issue arose with the people on the ship who were getting more and more of this enzyme when they didn't need it. Imagine just you have an initiation site, and that's fine. That's where the routine changes are supposed to happen. And then, because you ate somebody, another initiation site next to it, and then another and another, until your genetic coding becomes something like soup, always changing and always adapting. So the colonists themselves should have been released onto the planet, but then they just adapted to a dark ship. But due to the actions of Gallo, they had no choice. They subsequently, by consuming the somatic cells of colonists, the cannibals introduced the enzyme either in a great capacity in their bodies or when it wasn't needed, as they were, children who were already adapted, and these genes were then passed on by their parents. So subsequently, they were further altered by the enzyme that they were consuming. This led to monsters to be on board, as the release date ran 800 years past what it was initially supposed to end. All because one dude went a little haywire, decided to get frisky. Ultimately, this would cause somewhat of a genetic bottleneck for those that survived, but due to the lack of resources and time, I'm sure that's not going to be a problem. These pioneers are just going to have to basically either ride it out in the ship until they get established on land, which potentially they will revert back to a tribal society themselves, unless there is tech waiting for them on the ship, in which case, they might be alright, but it's not a lot of people. Although I'm sure with the recombination event, likely the issue of inbreeding has already been addressed. But I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be great. Subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and channel links in the description for all those that are interested. Roanoke Tales is back up and running, and speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you once again to our astronaut Wesley A. Weaver Jr. Thanks, man. I'd also like to thank our astrophysicist, Death Dancer and Phoenix, as well as our scientists, Countryside Limbo, Lacune, and Vibing Shockwave. And the rest of my patrons, I thank you guys as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping everything running around here and keeping the lights on, so that's greatly appreciated. Alright, so that does it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and we'll see y'all in the next one.